Most of the boys on the team have a very horizontal backswing, which encourages a horizontal forward swing, which severely limits the racket face's low to high motion through ball contact, and that reduces lift and topspin. Pros have a mostly vertical backswing. Looking at one of the new guys, Carlos Alcaraz, who won the US Open, Carlos has a semi-western forehand grip, which is why his racket face is towards the ground as it appears from behind his body. Notice that he starts by swinging the racket out to his right side during the unit turn, and as he does so, he starts to raise it until the tip of the racket is above his head. His racket starts raising significantly between this photo and this photo. In this photo, his chest is facing the right side fence, and his racket is on that side of his body and will mostly stay on that side until after ball contact. His racket travels mostly vertically. He's basically dropping it down towards the back fence. In this photo, the tip of his racket barely goes behind his back, and that's referred to as breaking the plane. In these three photos, his wrist cocks back more and more until he reaches full racket lag in the last photo, in this photo. The racket head is lagging behind his right hand. And in this photo, you can see that he started his early shoulder turn towards the net as the racket face drops below his right shoulder. He starts executing what's called the flip by this photo. The racket goes from pointing roughly towards the right net post in this photo to pointing in the opposite direction by this photo. He does the flip by rapidly moving his hand toward ball contact as he starts his shoulder turn. Swing forward to ball contact is mostly a tilted pendulum with very little wrist rotation. Look at the white mark on his wristband. It stays on the side of his wrist up until contact. There's a bit of a dip. The racket head drops a bit between this photo and this photo. In this photo, it's the low point, and that produces a bigger low to high motion of the racket face into ball contact, producing more lift and more topspin. You can tell there's a bit of a dip because the end of the racket head looks to be about the same distance above the baseline, but if the racket head had stayed the same height, it would have looked like it was higher because it was close to the net. By ball contact, this photo, his shoulders have turned 90 degrees to face the net, and his left arm has rotated with them. At ball contact, Carlos begins his windshield wiper, during which the racket tips up and over and tips toward the net as well. This photo, the racket handle and racket face are not vertical as it goes between his head and the net. Notice he keeps his head still until way after ball contact. He finishes tipping the racket over by this photo. Notice that the racket face, which was tipped toward the net halfway through the windshield wiper, is now vertical again, as it was at ball contact. Notice also that his right hand was about mid-stomach height at ball contact, but just over the top of his head at the end of the wiper. Notice that his shoulders have barely rotated during the previous 5 photos. His head is barely moved, and his left arm hasn't been flung around behind him. In this photo, the racket has finished tipping up and over and is just starting to swing around behind him. The racket then continues to swing around behind him. This photo, this photo, this photo, this photo, this photo. Notice that, even though his racket is swung way around behind him by the last photo, by this photo, his shoulders are still roughly facing the net. The shoulder turn is there to provide power. It pulls the arm, the right arm, into the ball. The right arm and racket into the ball. How do the big three take their rackets back? Here's Djokovic. He looks pretty much the same as Alcaraz, he also uses a semi-western forehand grip. He swings the racket around as he starts his unit turn, and then lifts it higher than his head. Notice he doesn't break the plane either. The racket stays on the front side of his body. And after the racket reaches the top, he drops it down toward the back fence. What about Nadal? Also semi-western, but left-handed. Same condiments as for Djokovic. You can see that he swings it around and then up and over his head and then down, all in a vertical plane till he gets down to the point or he's ready to start swinging the racket forward, with the racket face tilted mostly down. Finally, my man Federer, my favorite, much the same, but he has an Eastern grip, so the racket face is at a different angle as he starts swinging it around. It's more tilted a little bit toward the left than toward the ground. He doesn't break the plane either, as he drops the racket face down, and his racket face is horizontal at pat the dog, this photo, at the start of the flip. You can see his shoulders just start to turn in this photo. Because he makes ball contact quite high for this forehand, the pendulum swing to ball contact is nearly horizontal, but there is still a bit of a rise to give him some lift and some topspin. In this photo, his wrist is cocked back about 90 degrees, but by ball contact, his stretched muscles have shortened a bit, and his wrist is only cocked back about 45 degrees at that point. And this causes the racket to tilt forward as he swings it up and over in the windshield wiper. Because Federer is making high ball contact, it tips forward more than Alcaraz's racket tips forward. Notice that the racket face is tilted down about the same amount in this photo below at the end of the wiper as it was in this photo. After the end of the windshield wiper, he lets the racket swinging around behind him start his shoulders rotating again, this photo and this photo. Here's some photos comparing the parts of his swing during the low ball contact to the high ball contact of the pictures above. Notice that with the low ball contact, this photo, this photo, this photo, this photo, this photo, his racket face is tipped down toward the ground more, second photo, this photo, than for a high ball contact, this photo. So if you want to copy the best and do this mostly vertical backswing, this high take back, vertical backstring, gravity drop, and then forward into contact.